They arrived without fanfare, no flashing lights or majestic descent, only a clinical broadcast in every human language simultaneously. The transmission was sterile, devoid of emotion. A synthetic voice announced that Earth had been surveyed, and its technological level deemed insufficient for diplomatic parity. Humanity, it said, would be absorbed into the Zerlon Collective, a vast interstellar empire whose biomechanical dominion stretched across dozens of star systems. Resistance was discouraged. Our weapons, they claimed, were primitive combustion-based relics, ineffective against the integrated shielding and plasma matrices of their fleets. The message concluded with an exact timetable: invasion in 13 Earth days. In global headquarters, the atmosphere thickened with disbelief. Scientists, generals, and politicians stared at intercepted Zerlon footage, images of tanks, jets, and ballistic missiles from human archives being analyzed and mocked by what resembled floating crystalline intelligences. The aliens ridiculed the use of tracked vehicles, chemical propulsion, and mechanical ballistic systems. They called them artifacts of pre-quantum warfare, laughable when compared to the neurobonded constructs they deployed: ships grown, not built, armor that healed, weapons that thought. But humans weren't laughing. Despite being outmatched, the United Nations convened in a closed emergency summit. Centuries of mistrust were shelved in minutes. For the first time since World War II, the world's superpowers unified militarily under one doctrine. Human defensive infrastructure, long dormant or underfunded, was activated. No one cared if it was new or old, as long as it worked. From Arizona's desert to Siberian frost fields, storage depots opened, revealing tanks from every generation, dust-covered, oil-starved, but functional. In bunkers, crews scrambled. Engineers rewired circuitry, removed vulnerable digital modules, and replaced targeting systems with analog scopes. Tank divisions that had once trained for museum exhibitions were quietly reassembled into fighting formations. Tactical briefings relied on geography and kinetic force, not orbital superiority. There were no illusions of victory, only the raw determination to force a cost high enough to be remembered. Meanwhile, public response fractured along familiar lines: panic, skepticism, denial. Protesters labeled it a psyop. Conspiracy forums trended with theories of false flag operations or elite fabrications. But as the first Zerlon Vanguard pierced lunar orbit and disabled a third of Earth's satellite grid, the delusion cracked. Communications blackouts began. Financial markets plummeted. Skies above major cities rippled with aurora-like disturbances, side effects of alien distortion fields. Suddenly, belief wasn't optional. News stations ran 24-hour coverage. Footage emerged of vaporized defense satellites, shredded drones, and stealth aircraft falling from the sky like burning birds. Zerlon forces didn't issue demands or deliver ultimatums. They treated Earth like a pest to be sterilized. In meetings of military leadership, a grim calculus was laid bare: fighting on the ground, with steel and fuel, might be the only path left. What the aliens didn't understand, couldn't, was the nature of human defiance. They computed probabilities, projected collapse timelines, estimated yield equations. But they misjudged the irrational calculus of a species forged through war and survival. They didn't understand how much rage a scorched homeland could fuel. They didn't factor in the emotional bond between a soldier and a machine covered in scratches, patches, and names etched into its hull. They thought our weapons were weak because they were old. They failed to grasp that age was not decay, it was experience embedded in steel. Analysts noticed patterns in the Zerlon deployments: rigid formations, predictable sweep patterns, automated prioritization of digital threats. That gave humans an unexpected edge. Machines that couldn't be electronically locked or remotely disabled, because they had no electronics to begin with, became suddenly useful. An old diesel-powered tank with a manual turret had immunity to Zerlon viral pulses. Cold War vehicles built without software survived EMP blasts that wiped out 5th-gen aircraft. In an ironic twist, obsolescence became a shield. Veterans, long retired, were recalled. Mechanics who once taught museum classes were now advisors for retrofitting combat vehicles. The factories retooled not for high-tech warfare but for volume, tracks, shells, reinforced plating, simple systems that couldn't be hacked, only destroyed through brute force. Nations began deploying wave after wave of analog war machines, operated by crews trained not in simulators but under fire. As the alien fleets closed in, Earth prepared for the unimaginable, not with grace or symmetry, but with defiance forged in rust, grease, and blood. Humanity's armor wasn't built in the stars. It was forged in scrapyards and garages, in sweat and soot. Our weapons didn't pulse with light, they roared with fire. And when the Zerlon made landfall, they would find not a broken species, but a planet that refused to be tamed. They called our weapons primitive. Let them. They struck without pause. As Earth's skies fractured with energy pulses, orbital defense grids failed before they could activate. Zerlon warships descended in coordinated silence, their presence marked not by thunder but by the absence of sound, reality bending around their graviton engines. Major cities experienced instant blackouts. EMP waves rolled through infrastructure, frying power stations and communication hubs within seconds. Aircraft dropped from the skies like dead birds. Nuclear silos went dark, satellites spun out of control, and oceans churned under the pressure of ionized displacement fields. Humanity's initial response was scattered. Command centers buried deep underground lost connection with entire branches of their own militaries. Pilots screamed into radios that emitted only static. The Zerlon had turned the world blind and deaf in minutes. Civilians were caught unaware. Roads clogged with panicked traffic. Emergency services collapsed under the weight of demand and confusion. Skyscrapers melted beneath particle streams. Anything standing tall became a target. Alien ground units, if they could be called that, landed in symmetrical formations. Massive biomechanical constructs with fluid exoskeletons, towering over human tanks, moved with unnerving grace. Zerlon drones swarmed like locusts, mapping terrain, tagging heat signatures, and erasing resistance in seconds. Firearms were useless. Missiles misfired or exploded prematurely. Technology that once ruled battlefields now cowered under the weight of something older, colder, and mercilessly efficient. Entire air forces vanished before takeoff. Naval fleets, stripped of radar and sonar, floated aimlessly until swallowed by plasma bursts. The Global Defense Protocol, crafted over decades, collapsed in under 6 hours. Military analysts had no data to parse, only silence. The war hadn't begun. It was already being lost. But in the cracks of global failure, pockets of adaptation formed. Isolated command bunkers switched to analog equipment, using radio systems decades out of circulation. Steam-powered generators were dragged from museum basements. Tactical orders were delivered by couriers on motorcycles. What was once archaic now became vital. In the absence of digital systems, the Zerlon struggled to identify threats. Their AI-driven assessments could not anticipate irregular, human-made redundancies. A battalion of tanks in northern Europe, running on manual guidance, ambushed a scout formation. The damage inflicted was minor, but the reaction it triggered was profound. The aliens paused, not from fear, but from confusion. These weren't the threats their simulations had accounted for. Zerlon forces began recalibrating, but every minute of confusion was a moment humans needed. Old tank divisions were reassembled. Crews operated under candlelight, using hand-drawn maps and verbal codes. Analog artillery found new purpose. Mines laid decades ago were reactivated. Rural resistance surged. Farmers turned their fields into choke points. Towns funneled alien patrols into tight streets where mobility became a disadvantage. Guerrilla tactics evolved by the hour. Human fighters, no longer reliant on satellites or networked coordination, adapted using terrain, instinct, and desperation. Bridges were rigged with controlled demolitions. Railways became trap-laden corridors. Civilians fled into forests, caves, and mountains. Every fallen drone was dismantled for salvage. Every destroyed vehicle became raw material for the next defense. Yet despite the surge of resistance, the toll was catastrophic. Cities were leveled without engagement. Millions perished. Landmarks crumbled. Cultural centers were vaporized. The aliens did not distinguish between military and civilian. To them, Earth was a node to be rewritten. The extermination wasn't cruelty, it was a form of sterile efficiency. And yet, that lack of cruelty became their first mistake. The absence of emotion turned them blind to human hatred. Humanity didn't resist out of tactical advantage, it resisted because surrender was unthinkable. For every city lost, another town rose in fury. For every commander killed, another volunteer took their place. The Zerlon underestimated a species that had survived ice ages, plagues, empires, and its own self-destruction. They had misjudged what it meant to fight not for conquest but for survival. As ground war spread, a pattern emerged. The more digital the resistance, the faster it failed. The more analog it became, the longer it endured. Diesel-powered vehicles, manually aimed artillery, crank-ignited backup systems, these became invaluable. Human units began coordinating over shortwave radio, using Morse code and encryption techniques last employed in the 20th century. Soldiers trained in outdated doctrines suddenly became commanders of relevance. In the ashes of modern warfare, old war books were dusted off. Blueprints for obsolete vehicles were redrawn. Factories resumed production of armored steel, not circuit boards. The age of precision was dead. The age of force had returned. Humanity had not yet won a battle. But it had learned to survive the opening blow. In doing so, it exposed a fracture in the alien strategy, reliance on predictability. The Zerlon war machine was efficient, but rigid. It had no protocol for chaos. And that was humanity's language. The turning point didn't arrive with advanced technology, or a miracle weapon. It came through steel, oil, and recoil. Deep in the Carpathians, an old motor pool was unearthed, rows of Cold War-era T-80s, long thought obsolete. Mechanics powered them up with rebuilt engines, stripped the electronics, and prepped them for combat. These machines, relics by modern standards, ran purely on mechanics and fuel. Their survival in the electromagnetic chaos made them uniquely valuable. Their armor wasn't smart, but it was thick. Their guns didn't require calibration, they required courage. Elsewhere, M1 Abrams tanks were pulled from reserve, gutted of sensitive systems, and retrofitted with hardened components. They were clumsy, loud, and utterly analog, traits that made them invisible to the Zerlon network. To alien sensors, they registered as inert wreckage until they fired. That mistake cost the invaders dearly. In one instance, a convoy of Zerlon crawlers advanced through mountain passes. Hidden among the rocks were dozens of tanks operating in total silence. The humans waited until visual range. When the signal came, cannon fire echoed through the cliffs. Kinetic rounds punched through the synthetic armor of the alien constructs, tearing internal systems apart. The invaders' energy shielding, designed to deflect high-frequency particle streams, failed against solid steel slugs traveling at hypersonic speeds. It wasn't elegance. It was violence made methodical. What followed wasn't victory, it was shock. For the first time, alien forces retreated from a front line. Zerlon algorithms logged the incident as an anomaly. Their models couldn't process a battlefield where logic broke down. Primitive combustion vehicles had outmaneuvered precision drones. Smoke and camouflage had nullified infrared sweeps. Human unpredictability didn't fit into lines of code. Word of the tank's success spread rapidly, even without satellites. Radio relays and recovered fiber lines carried the message. Across continents, old war machines were revived. Africa reactivated Soviet-era T-55s. South America deployed AMX-30s. Asia refurbished Type 59s and Centurions. No region was idle. Manuals were reprinted. Fuel was rationed. Crews were assembled from veterans, students, and anyone who could load a shell and follow orders. The tanks themselves began to evolve. Mechanics installed reactive armor crafted from scrap. Welders attached sloped plating from train cars and naval wrecks. Ammunition was mixed from black market stores and repurposed military stockpiles. Some units even modified their tanks with stolen alien components, mounting salvaged plasma cores into gutted turrets to power experimental coil guns. These prototypes rarely survived more than one battle, but when they hit, even Zerlon dreadforms fell. Alien Command attempted to counter. They deployed skimmer units equipped with gravitational disruptors designed to disable tracked movement. But human crews learned to adapt. They chained their tanks to concrete moorings or buried them beneath terrain that absorbed energy pulses. Others used natural terrain, ravines, forests, ice fields, to trap and isolate targets. The mobility of tanks became secondary to their presence. If a tank could aim, it could kill. Human psychology amplified the effect. Alien troops began to avoid areas with heavy armored resistance. The sight of tanks advancing through fire and debris became symbolic, a form of psychological warfare the Zerlon were unprepared for. These were not automated turrets or programmed drones. They were manned fortresses, each with a crew that didn't fear death, only failure. In one campaign, a mixed formation of Indian, Polish, and Egyptian tanks held a valley against triple their number. The Zerlon focused fire, reducing the human force to wrecks. But from the smoke, one tank emerged, engine ablaze, turret jammed, and rammed into the alien command relay, detonating with its final shell. That broadcasted image became legend. It was sent to every resistance cell, etched onto walls, and repeated on every surviving frequency. Tanks could bleed the enemy. As victories grew, doctrines shifted. Tanks weren't just backup, they were the new vanguard. Infantry followed their wake. Artillery operated in tandem. Supply chains reformed to support their fuel needs. Engineers built roads through wastelands just to deploy armored units. Humanity had found a counterweight to the alien advantage. The Zerlon acknowledged the shift. Their AI adjusted threat ratings for armored vehicles. Their formations spread wider, avoided choke points, began deploying mines designed to interfere with analog operation. But human crews adapted faster. Field modifications were constant. Crews altered engine intakes, reinforced tracks, and rewired fire systems to avoid alien interference. Every tank became unique, personalized instruments of survival and defiance. None of it was planned. It was instinctive. A species cornered had turned its oldest weapons into its sharpest claws. The aliens had labeled tanks as irrelevant. Now they called them priority threats. And that change in definition marked the first true shift in the war. The tanks didn't represent technology. They represented intent. And that made them unstoppable. The battlefield evolved faster than alien simulations could account for. Human adaptability defied the linear logic the Zerlon relied on. Within days, soldiers began constructing weapons from salvaged scrap and stripped-down tech. In the absence of uniform supply chains, local engineers designed new systems from outdated hardware. Agricultural vehicles were reinforced with steel plating and fitted with repurposed turrets. Mechanics armed forklifts and bulldozers, transforming industrial tools into improvised war machines. Each region of the world developed unique battlefield solutions tailored to their geography, resources, and history. Without global networks, human forces turned to centuries-old communication systems. Morse code, smoke signals, signal flares, anything that bypassed digital channels. Resistance cells began coordinating over analog radio waves, sending short bursts of encrypted messages that alien tracking systems failed to detect. Even musical tones and coded drumbeats were reintroduced in some areas. The result wasn't elegant, but it was effective. Human command had reemerged, fragmented but persistent. Urban areas became traps. In dense cityscapes, the Zerlon's size and rigidity worked against them. Building interiors were weaponized with explosives, steel cables, and trapdoors. Human fighters used underground tunnels, sewer systems, and collapsed infrastructure to flank and disable patrols. Alien drones were lured into kill zones with heat signatures, only to be disabled by Molotovs and slug rounds at close range. With no centralized command, human squads operated with autonomy, adjusting in real time without hierarchy. The chaos made their tactics unreadable. Salvage operations grew into full-scale production. Fallen Zerlan units were harvested for components, power cells, armor fragments, wiring. Universities repurposed physics labs into makeshift development centers. Scientists reverse-engineered captured devices, often with minimal understanding, pushing the boundaries of trial and error. Some teams created hybrid weapons, rocket launchers powered by alien cores, railguns fed with scavenged capacitors. While many exploded during use, the ones that worked did irreparable damage. Supply scarcity forced innovation. Ammunition was hand-forged. Old chemical factories resumed operation under military oversight. Even animal transport made a comeback in remote zones, oxen pulling artillery, horses moving wounded through rough terrain. Nothing was discarded. The culture of waste vanished, replaced with relentless purpose. Civilians became part of the chain. Blacksmiths, chemists, machinists, each person contributed. Entire towns converted to production nodes, operating in shifts without sleep. Psychological warfare intensified. Human resistance broadcasted distorted music and voice loops over captured alien frequencies. They projected ghost signals to confuse patrol routes. Children painted alien kill counts on tank hulls. Mocking banners were hung across ruins. Still think we're primitive? These acts served no tactical function, but they eroded the enemy's confidence. The Zerlan AI, designed to optimize based on patterns, could not quantify the strategic value of defiance. That failure led to hesitation. In South America, fighters used jungle terrain to dismantle alien supply carriers, disabling leg joints with spiked vines and structural sabotage. In Central Asia, fighters triggered avalanches over alien convoys using manual charges. Arctic resistance teams lured thermal-based drones into frozen lakes by disguising body heat. No tactic repeated, no rhythm detected. Every strike was new. The unpredictability rewrote the war. Aliens responded by deploying automated shock units. These machines lacked the hesitation of their organic hybrids, executing commands with mechanical speed. But that created another vulnerability. Unlike their predecessors, these machines couldn't adapt. They followed instructions blindly. Human resistance exploited this flaw by baiting them into loop traps, minefields disguised as shelter, false transmissions leading into dead zones, decoy heat signatures luring them into fuel fires. Even airspace, once dominated by the invaders, saw disruption. Hang gliders, weather balloons, and retrofitted prop planes launched improvised payloads. Human forces used terrain to compensate for the lack of altitude dominance, hiding launchers on mountain peaks and canyon walls. Artillery regiments used echolocations and sound bounces to determine enemy positions without visual confirmation. Wherever the Zerlan expected strategy, they found instinct. Where they expected structure, they found chaos. And within that chaos, human willpower thrived. Each act of resistance taught something new. Every failure informed the next attempt. This constant cycle of adjustment made it impossible to map a pattern. Alien war models degraded with each passing day. The concept of victory changed. No longer measured by territory or hardware, it became a matter of momentum. Human actions, no matter how small, disrupted alien confidence. The enemy came expecting obedience to technological superiority. What they found was a species unwilling to yield, willing to bleed, and impossible to predict. The battlefield had stopped being a simulation. It had become a contest of endurance. And in that contest, humanity refused to fall behind. The counteroffensive began with no declaration, no broadcast, no warning. Human forces moved in complete radio silence, relying on synchronized analog timers and pre-distributed orders. Across 5 continents, units struck simultaneously. Every vehicle that could still run was pushed into combat. Tanks that had survived multiple battles led the charge, their hulls patched with layers of scrap metal, scorched but functional. Behind them, infantry units followed on foot, supported by makeshift artillery built from salvaged industrial parts. No uniform, no formation, only raw coordination driven by necessity and timing. The Zerlon defensive grid, once precise and overwhelming, was overextended. They had built their occupation on the assumption of submission, not persistence. Their automated systems processed threats by statistical relevance. What they couldn't calculate was that humans had stopped caring about odds. Entire battalions surged forward with full knowledge that return was unlikely. Success wasn't measured in survival, but in damage inflicted. That mindset warped the enemy's expectations. In the Middle East, armored columns cut through alien barricades using terrain to mask their approach. In Eastern Europe, tank divisions crossed frozen rivers using improvised ice bridges, losing half their number before making landfall, yet the rest kept advancing. On the African front, local forces coordinated a pincer strike using signal mirrors and runners, encircling an alien processor hub and destroying it with a single explosive-laden truck. Not one unit survived. The loss was total. The success was absolute. Even the oceans joined the final push. Rusted submarines launched torpedoes with manually adjusted trajectories. Coastal cities, stripped bare of luxuries, became launch sites for long-range missiles built in underground workshops. Accuracy didn't matter. Volume did. Human strategy became one of saturation, so many simultaneous threats that alien systems couldn't react in time. By the time one attack was processed, another 3 were already inbound. In the Pacific, guerrilla divers sabotaged underwater relay towers using hand-planted charges. On the ice shelves of the South, teams braved -50°C conditions to set up signal jammers powered by wind turbines, blinding orbital units for hours at a time. The disruption cascaded. Alien coordination buckled under pressure. Their unity, once a strength, became a liability. Their dependency on precision rendered them vulnerable to noise. Humans gave them noise in every frequency. What the Zerlon didn't realize until too late was that the tanks weren't just weapons, they were carriers of morale. Each was a rolling memory of those who had fallen, a mobile shrine covered in names and battle tallies. Their continued movement, even when broken, served as psychological anchors. Entire infantry units advanced simply because the tanks had. When one went down, crews were pulled from the wreckage and placed in another. The symbol had to keep moving. No one allowed them to stop. One final push targeted the core of the alien occupation, a planetary central relay buried beneath what remained of a former metropolis. The terrain was radioactive, shredded, unstable. The approach was vertical. Every unit sent was considered expendable. But none turned back. Leading the charge was a composite crew, soldiers from 4 nations packed into a tank held together with bolts, chain, and belief. They pushed through wave after wave of fire, losing turret function, communications, then steering. They drove forward manually, using sheer momentum, until the hull breached the relay perimeter. Inside the remains of the vehicle sat one shell. One final, hand-loaded round. No guidance. No targeting system. Just raw intuition. It was fired blindly into the exposed machinery. The resulting explosion wasn't fire. It was silence. The entire grid flickered, pulsed, then died. Across the planet, alien units froze mid-action, left vulnerable. Human forces didn't hesitate. They pressed the advantage in every zone, sweeping through stunned opposition with overwhelming force. The retreat was unceremonious. No final battle, no last speech. Zerlon fleets disengaged from orbit, ascending in unison, abandoning their constructs without recovery. For a moment, Earth held its breath. Then came the first cheer, low and uncertain. But it spread. Across ruins, across shelters, across wrecked cities and scorched plains, the cry of survival echoed. Victory didn't come clean. It came ragged and soaked in cost. The planet was scarred. Billions were gone. Infrastructure lay in ruin. But humanity stood, not as it had before, but as something different. Hardened. Unified. A species that had survived annihilation by using everything others dismissed as broken or outdated. From steel tanks to analog radios, from instincts to sacrifice, everything had mattered. A final intercepted message confirmed what no one dared hope. Subject species no longer classified as primitive. Reassessment, existential hazard. Recommend avoidance. For humanity, that was enough. The war was over. The warning had been delivered. The stars would remember.